The first lash tore her blouse, the second tore her skin, but she still didn't cry out. Clara Grey stood barefoot in the dust outside St. Vincent's Chapel, while the preacher's belt came down like it was an offering to God himself. Her arms were tied to the crossbeam of the hitch post, her head bowed not from shame, but to hide the fire still burning in her eyes. The crowd had gathered fast. Townsfolk who wouldn't look her in the eye yesterday now stood with bated breath, watching like they were owed this spectacle. "For fornication," the preacher shouted between strikes. "For wickedness and deceit." The woman beside the sheriff nodded. The mayor's wife dabbed her eyes. No one stepped forward, not even when the sixth strike drew blood thick enough to wet the chapel's steps. Clara had always been different, too sharp, too proud, too unwilling to beg. She ran her father's old blacksmith forge after he passed and didn't smile when men called her sweetheart. The town never liked that. Then the boy came, a banker's son who snuck into her bed with whispered promises and clean hands. He left 2 weeks later. She stayed. And when her stomach began to swell, the punishment followed. She was 27, unwed, and unrepentant. That was enough. The preacher raised his hand for the 7th time, and that's when the silence shifted. Not from Clara, not from the crowd, but from the edge of the square, where a man in a dust-stained duster stepped forward and didn't stop walking. He had no badge, no rifle, no reason to belong, but he walked straight through the people like they weren't there. The preacher hesitated. Clara lifted her head. Blood on her lip, hair matted. Her eyes locked on the stranger, not with pleading, but recognition. She didn't know him, but something in her body did. He stepped onto the chapel steps, reached for the knot in the rope, and untied it without a word. No one moved, not even the sheriff. When her arms fell free, she collapsed. He caught her mid-fall, held her like he'd done it before, like this was the reason he was born. And still, he said nothing, just wrapped her gently in his coat and stood between her and the town. They never heard him speak, and she never had to. They didn't follow him. Not one soul from the chapel dared. The cowboy walked with Clara in his arms, her blood soaking through his coat, his boots steady against the dry, cracked street that had never seen a man like him. She wasn't conscious, just drifting in and out, her lips parted, eyes fluttering like someone half between pain and a dream. But her fingers, barely curled, clung to the edge of his collar like she knew she was finally safe. He didn't take her to the doctor. He didn't ask for help. He walked to the edge of town, past the smithy, past the well, to the little cabin where the widow Grafton once lived, long since abandoned and left to rot. He kicked the door open and laid her gently on the cot inside, stripped off the ruined blouse, and cleaned the wounds with water from his own canteen. His hands were precise but soft, like he'd done this before, like he'd carried broken things that deserved more than the world had given. When she woke, it was dark. The coat still lay over her, heavy with his scent, earth, tobacco, and something faintly like sage. Her back throbbed. Her lips were swollen, but her mind was clear. She sat up, slow, clutching the coat to her chest, and looked around. He was there, just a few feet away, sitting on the floor beside the door, hat pulled low, watching her with eyes the color of dusk. "Why?" she whispered. Her voice cracked. It didn't seem to faze him. He just tilted his head slightly, then looked down at his hands. She tried again. "You don't even know me." He said nothing. Just took a deep breath, reached into his pocket and pulled out a strip of leather, torn, weathered, but stitched at the edge. He held it up. She recognized it instantly, her father's branding strap, the one he used on every finished horse. She hadn't seen it in years. She gasped. "Where did you get that?" The man finally looked her dead in the eye, and for one long second she saw something flicker behind his silence. Not fear, not pity, but something closer to memory. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The strap lay across his palm like a question only she could answer. Clara reached for the strap like it might burn her. The stitching was still there. Her father's initials on one side, the faint starburst he'd carved on a drunken Sunday etched into the edge. It wasn't just a tool. It was legacy. "This was lost in the fire," she said, her voice thin, disbelieving. "I looked for it for weeks." The cowboy's face didn't change. He set it gently on the table beside her, then leaned back, his silence heavy with something that filled the room more than words ever could. "Did you know him?" she asked. "My father?" He blinked once, then reached into his coat and pulled out a folded scrap of paper, creased, yellowed, barely holding together. He slid it across the table. Her hands shook as she opened it. It was a sketch, rough, charcoal-smeared but unmistakable. Her father, laughing, holding a little girl on his shoulders, her. She covered her mouth, tears springing up too fast to stop. "Who are you?" she whispered. He pointed to the bottom corner of the paper. A signature. M. Grafton. Her breath caught. "Miriam Grafton's boy?" The cowboy gave the faintest nod. Clara remembered her. The widow who lived outside town. The one folks said took in every stray, human or otherwise. Died during the flood. People claimed no family ever came to bury her. But she had a son, and that son had drawn this. "You watched us," Clara said, stunned. "You were there that day." He nodded again. "Why didn't you say something? Back then?" Still, he said nothing. She looked at him, truly looked this time, at the way his jaw tightened when he breathed, at the scar that split his eyebrow like a forgotten word. He hadn't come to rescue her. He'd come to return something. A memory, a kindness, a truth no one else had carried. "You saw me before they did," she murmured. "And now you're here again." His eyes met hers. They didn't need a sentence, just a silence deep enough to hold all that had never been said. Outside, the wind shifted, and for the first time in days, Clara didn't feel ashamed of the name she carried. When Clara stepped outside the cabin the next morning, the air tightened. Dust curled around her bare ankles like it too was waiting to see what she'd do next. The church bell rang, distant and cold. She wore her father's old coat now, patched at the elbows, and beneath it, bandages pressed against healing flesh. The silent cowboy followed her out, but kept his distance, shadowing her like a promise no one else had the courage to make. The town had expected her to vanish, crawl away in shame, maybe flee to the next county like the others who were branded before her. That's what women did after the belt. Disappeared. Hid. Broke. But Clara didn't. She walked to the smithy with her chin high, unlocked the door with a rusted key, and lit the forge like she had every morning before the boy with clean hands ruined everything. Flames roared to life. She fed them with scrap iron and coals that had waited too long for someone to believe they were still useful. By noon, people began to appear. Not to help. Not to speak. Just to watch. The mayor's son crossed the street, caught sight of her at the anvil, and turned white as paper. He didn't wave. He didn't stop. She let him walk. He'd said nothing when she was dragged into the square. He didn't deserve a word now. But what made him stumble wasn't just her. It was the man beside her, hammering slowly at a blade, sleeves rolled to the elbow, scars visible and quiet like truth carved into skin. He never looked up. never asked for a wage. But he stood beside her the whole time, the same rhythm in his swing as hers, as if they'd learned the beat from the same fire. When a child came near with wide eyes and a copper coin, Clara took it gently and handed the boy a horseshoe she'd etched with a single star. The same star that lay stitched into the strap her father once owned. The child smiled, ran off. Clara didn't smile back, but her eyes softened. And when she glanced toward the cowboy, he finally met her gaze, steady and proud. She wasn't the story the town wanted anymore. She was the story it couldn't ignore. They called him the Silent One, long before he ever held Clara. No one knew his name. No one remembered when he arrived. But after that morning at the forge, the town learned how loud a man could be without saying a word. When the saloon's piano broke, he fixed it with 3 nails and a wire pulled from his saddlebag. When the blacksmith's bellows cracked, he built a new one with wood scavenged from the chapel fence. He never charged, never nodded, just worked. And still no one dared approach him without purpose, except Clara. She spoke around his silence like it was a language only she understood. "You want coffee or tea?" she'd ask, placing both mugs down without waiting. He always picked coffee. "You were a left-handed shooter, weren't you?" she asked one evening, noticing the way his right wrist bore the deep twist scars of a healed break. He didn't flinch, just raised his left hand, mimed a draw, and let it rest on the table between them. "What happened?" she asked. His fingers tapped 4 times, then a pause. 4 again. Morse code. A habit her father once taught her to watch for. A trap, that's what he spelled. She blinked. "You trusted someone." He looked away. The message had been enough. And that was how he told stories. In gestures, in pauses, in tools fixed and buttons sewn and horses calmed. Clara didn't need more, not from him. One night she brought out the box of belongings they'd saved from the fire years ago. Things she hadn't touched since her father died. Letters, burnt at the edges. A photograph with her mother's face faded but still smiling. A coin from the war. The cowboy sat beside her, picked up each piece like it belonged to him too. And when he reached the last item, a charred silver thimble, he closed her fingers around it and looked at her like the silence had finally said enough. She didn't cry, she just nodded. Because when the world had shouted at her, punished her, and turned away, this man had held her without noise, without question. And somehow, that silence had rebuilt more than any apology could. It was nearly dusk when the knock came. Sharp, deliberate, and wrong. Clara stood from the forge stool, wiping soot from her palms as the cowboy stepped ahead of her, hand resting lightly on the knife tucked behind his belt. The door creaked open to reveal Reverend Alder, boots polished, collar starched, no trace of the man who'd swung the belt before God and a watching town. "I've come to speak," he said, voice clipped but low. The cowboy didn't move. Clara stepped forward. "To speak," she repeated, "or to ask forgiveness." The preacher looked past her, into the dark corners of the cabin. "There are rumors, whispers of your defiance. The townsfolk are unsettled." "Are they?" she said coolly. "I wonder why." He shifted uncomfortably. "Your return to the forge, the man beside you, the boy you carry, stop there." Her voice snapped sharp as an anvil's strike. "You forfeited the right to speak of him the moment you raised your hand instead of your heart." The preacher's jaw tightened. "I acted on scripture." "You acted on fear." She folded her arms, felt the cowboy's presence just behind her. Quiet, grounded, immovable. "You punished me to make others stay silent." "And yet here you are," he muttered, still standing. "Because someone chose to hold me when no one else would." The Reverend's eyes flicked to the man at her side, something bitter flashing across his face. "He's not of this town." "Neither am I anymore," she replied. "I've outlived its judgment." The preacher sighed, stepped back. "Pride is a sin, Miss Grey." "And cowardice is a plague," she said, "one I've stopped inheriting." He left without blessing her, without apology, without even saying her name. But Clara smiled as she shut the door, because for once, she hadn't needed his permission to speak. The cowboy met her eyes, lifted one brow slightly. "He won't come back," she said. The man reached into the hearth's ashes, pulled a red coal with the tongs, and pressed it gently into the iron that would mold her new brand, one not of punishment, but of choice. And for the first time in her life, Clara Grey would carry a mark that meant she belonged to no one but herself. By the end of the week, Clara's name had turned from whispered shame to clenched jaw warning. Men passed her on the street and tipped their hats not out of politeness, but because they didn't want to meet her eyes. The same mouths that called her harlot now muttered witch or marked, like silence had turned her dangerous. Maybe it had. Maybe the absence of her apology was louder than any sermon. She walked beside the cowboy every evening, past the well, through the market, sometimes hand on her belly, other times resting against his arm like it had always been her place. He still never spoke, but folks talked enough for both of them. At the general store, the clerk fumbled the change, wouldn't meet her gaze. At the saloon, 2 ranch hands stopped mid-drink when she entered for sugar, as if seeing her unbroken threatened something they'd told themselves about women like her. And the worst of them all, Annabelle, the banker's niece, spoke loud enough for the front porch to hear. "She didn't even say thank you. He risked his name for her and she walks like she earned it." Clara turned, slow and steady, and stared straight through her. "He didn't give me anything I didn't already own," she said. "He just made it visible." That shut the porch up. The cowboy stood behind her, arms crossed, unmoved, his silence louder than fists. Later that night, as they sat on the porch swing she'd rebuilt herself, she turned toward him and asked, "What do you see when they look at me like that?" He didn't answer with words. He reached into his pocket and handed her something wrapped in cloth. She unfolded it slowly. It was a broken nail, bent, burned, reshaped into a ring. Not perfect, not polished, but forged in fire and shaped by patience. Her fingers trembled. "This is—" She couldn't finish. He simply nodded. Not a proposal, not a claim, but a gesture. "You are not too ruined to be held." Clara didn't cry. She never had for pity. But her eyes shone, and she slipped the ring onto her finger without ceremony. The world had tried to silence her. But this man had taught her that silence could be strength, too, if it came from choice. And in that silence, she had finally begun to speak. The storm rolled in like it had a purpose. Low skies, sharp wind, and thunder that sounded more like memory than weather. Clara's contractions began just after dusk, no warning but the way her hand clutched the edge of the table and didn't let go. The cowboy didn't flinch. He built the fire higher, boiled water, stripped the bed with practiced hands. He didn't speak. He didn't pace. Just nodded when she said, "It's time," and stood beside her with the same stillness he'd offered from the first day. The wind howled like the town itself was trying to unmake her, but Clara didn't scream. She bore down, sweat soaking her brow, blood warming the blankets, and when her voice finally broke, when she cried out not from pain but from power, he was there, hands steady beneath her knees, catching a life she had never once believed she'd earn. A boy, red-faced, furious, alive. Clara laughed, breathless, broken open in every way a woman can be, and pulled the child to her chest. "He looks like me," she whispered. The cowboy reached forward, brushed the baby's cheek with the back of his knuckle, and for the first time, she saw his mouth form something close to a smile. "Will you name him?" she asked. He shook his head. She understood. This boy would carry no man's shame, no memory of a father who fled, no stain from the preacher's lash, only fire and quiet, and the steady silence of a man who had chosen to stay. "Then I'll name him after the wind," she said, "because it never breaks, even when the sky does." She didn't sleep that night. Neither did he. They took turns holding the child, rocking him with no lullaby but the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of thunder fading into dawn. Outside, the storm passed. The streets were washed clean. The town would whisper again, would invent new names for what they saw in her. But Clara wouldn't hear them, not anymore. She had built something louder, a life, a home, a child who came into this world wrapped not in shame, but in the warmth of a man who never said a word, but meant everything. 3 weeks after the birth, Clara returned to the town square, not to prove anything, not to confront ghosts, but because she wanted a lemon drop from the mercantile and refused to live like a fugitive in her own skin. She wore her hair unbound, the child strapped to her chest, and the silent man walking beside her with his usual slow, sure gait. People moved out of their way, not with hostility, but with hesitation, like giving space to a force of nature they couldn't understand. Outside the church, the doors remained shut. No bell rang. No sermon echoed. Reverend Alder hadn't spoken her name since the day she stood again. Rumor had it he'd requested transfer to a town in the east. Others said he stayed but never preached of women again. Either way, she passed without pausing. She owed no prayer to walls that once punished her body in God's name. A child waved from the bakery window. Clara smiled. The small things were beginning to return. Later that evening, she laid the baby down beneath the cotton blanket she'd sewn from her father's shirts and watched the way he slept. Mouth open, hands curled like he was still holding her heartbeat. "You think he'll understand?" she asked, not looking up. The cowboy didn't answer. He sat near the fire, carving something small between his fingers. She crossed the room, watched silently as the shape emerged. A horse. Not perfect, but familiar. "My first toy was just like this," she said, tracing the grain. "My father made it the night my mother died." The cowboy looked at her, eyes soft beneath the shadow of his brow. She placed the carving beside the sleeping child, then turned back to him. "What you gave me," she said slowly, "wasn't rescue. It was a place to return to when no one else waited." He rose slowly and took her hand. For a moment neither moved. There were no vows, no claims. But in that shared silence, there was the steady pulse of something whole. He brushed his fingers against her cheek. She leaned into it. And outside, as twilight fell across the cabin and the forge grew quiet, the town forgot how to define her. But she remembered who she was. Years later, they would whisper about her like she'd been a myth. Some said she cast spells from her forge. Others said the cowboy who followed her like a shadow wasn't real at all, just a ghost conjured from her shame. But those who met her eyes, truly met them, knew the truth. She'd been broken publicly and rose without permission. Not because someone fought for her, but because someone had stood beside her and refused to look away. The boy grew tall with her eyes and his silence. He'd ask once, when he was 9, why no one ever spoke the cowboy's name. Clara had smiled, kissed his head, and said, "Because names don't make a man real. Deeds do." On her final day in the forge, she sealed one last iron brand, just a circle, unbroken, joined at both ends, and hung it above the door. Not for sale, not for use, just a symbol that even what's scarred can be whole. She didn't speak much in those years, not like before. She didn't need to. The world had heard her scream once. Then it heard her rebuild. When she passed, it wasn't in a bed or under watch. It was in her swing, child asleep on her lap, sun dipping behind the chapel she no longer feared. And beside her still sat the man who had never spoken a word. His hand rested on hers. His eyes never closed. When they buried her, no priest was called. Just townsfolk with their hats in their hands, uncertain of what to say. But the boy spoke. She wasn't shamed, she was sacred. And with that he placed the broken nail ring, now worn thin, into her palm. They say the cowboy vanished after that, walked past the hills, never looked back. But the swing remained. So did the forge, and the brand above the door, because the town didn't build her legacy. She did, not with noise, not with rage, but with silence. Chosen, steady, sacred. She had been whipped in front of the church, but she had been held, truly held, by someone who didn't need to explain why she was worth it. And in the end, that was the loudest thing of all. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Echoes of the West, and tell us in the comments, can silence say more than any vow?